Welcome to The Loins of History, a podcast connecting history to current events. Last week we finished up our mini-series, I should say, on the Cultural Revolution with the death of Mao Zedong and the rise of Deng Xiaoping as the chairman of the CCP. And this week we're going to start talking about the second communique, or communique if you are French, depending on the pronunciation you want to have. Communique. That was kind of Russian, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't know what that was. that was more just sexy, Collin.
Everything I say is like that. Anyway, we're leaving all this in. After Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping became the chairman of the CCP, relations between the United States and China continued to improve, as we talked about a few weeks ago with Nixon and Kissinger visiting in 71 and 72. But it's going to become a tricky situation now because Taiwan was, up until this point, still recognized as the Republic of China. And as we all know, the Chinese want a one China policy. So how the U.S. is going to navigate the China-Taiwan situation, if you will, is going to be very tricky for the next couple of years. And it relates especially today because, as you've probably been seeing and reading about in the news, the Chinese have been conducting drills off the coast of Taiwan at an increased frequency. There's been different think tanks releasing reports about a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan and what would occur, potential casualties, win-loss scenarios, things like that. I believe the PLA even has their own initiative by 2027 for a unified China. So as we can see, this is going to become extremely relevant over the next couple of years and how we navigate it. And if we go back to 1979 with the second communique, this is kind of the genesis of where these Taiwan crisis really started to begin. So Jay, can you take us away with the key takeaways?
I will take us away.
Take us away with the takeaways. Jay, can you
take me away? I'm not even going to start. Yeah. So first key takeaway: the normalization of relations between the U.S. and the PRC, or People's Republic of China, were done in such a way that prevented conflict in the near term. So, like Collin said, that there were two explicit Taiwan Strait crises in the 50s. There will be a third in the 90s, but we haven't got there yet. The normalization of relations prevented another Taiwan Strait crisis in the short term. However, it left no guarantees to lasting peace, and we'll see why here in a second. Key takeaway number 2 here is that the U.S. solidified what we call our one China policy. Just to try to distinguish it from some other things, the CCP has what it's called is the one China principle, a little bit different than the U.S. one China policy. And we'll go into those details later, but the U.S. we created here in 1979. This episode's going to focus on 1979 and 1980. We clung to the one China policy in a position of strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity meaning we intentionally don't come down on one side or the other. Specifically, we will not say the one China policy is the U.S. not saying that that the proper suzerain of Taiwan is the Communist Chinese Party. Nor will we say Taiwan is its own independent country. We maintain this position of strategic ambiguity. However, if you read the news, especially here in the United States, you'll see that recent statements and the obvious deterioration of relations between the PRC and the U.S. show that ambiguity is starting to decrease, and that it appears the U.S. is basically de facto saying that Taiwan is an independent country. Last key takeaway number 3 is in 1979, when the Carter administration signed the Joint Communique that normalized relations between the PRC and the U.S., we swapped formal recognition of the government of China from Taiwan, also called the Republic of China or the ROC. We swapped it from them to the CCP and the PRC. By doing that, the U.S. cast significant doubt on its willingness to uphold commitments and treaties, because prior to that point, we had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, and it cast doubt on our commitment to a liberal world order. I've talked about what that means in previous episodes, but quickly and generically, a liberal world order is just simply saying, is like this post World War II idea that countries are independent, countries have a right to maintain their sovereignty, to include their territorial sovereignty. Countries have a right to not be invaded by a neighbor or anything like that. And there are certain legal grounds in which that is permissible and not permissible. And, the UN is kind of a big symbol of this liberal world order.
So, Jake, can you start telling the story of how it happened from Nixon? Because, after Nixon, it's not like things just became all hunky dory. What did we do between that 72 to 79 period? Because obviously relations were improving, but they hadn't normalized yet. So what do we do right after the Nixon visit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Colin. So, as we talked about 2 episodes ago, literally months after Nixon's visit to China, the Watergate scandal started brewing. And it would take some time. Nixon didn't immediately resign, but rather when it became clear that Nixon was kind of in hot water, legally speaking, he resigned. And that left Gerald Ford as the president. Gerald Ford, he finished out Nixon's second term. However, he lost election to Jimmy Carter. So there was a political shift there from Republicans to Democrats. That, as kind of as we saw with the Trump administration turning over to the Biden administration, there's just a bureaucratic inertia that has to change gears. And that takes time, like years, from political appointees, getting everybody through the Senate, etc. The United States can't shift its foreign policy on a dime, even when there's two different parties. We transition from Republicans to Democrats or Democrats to Republicans. So even though the Nixon administration, went over there, high-fived Chairman Mao, and everybody was all happy, not a whole lot of progress took place up until the Carter administration kind of got its feet underneath it. Russia is still very much the priority during the 70s. For foreign policy, the Carter administration had a debacle in 1979 with the Iranians.
And we were still reeling from Vietnam. There was still a lot of turmoil within the U.S.
Yeah, great point.
We were reeling from it, even though we had withdrawn. Saigon fell in 75, and we had effectively stopped providing combat troops on the ground in 72, I think. We were still reeling.
Right.
And that was back home. So it's not like we had a bunch of support to say, hey, let's go be friends with the Chinese.
Yeah. So because of that, the joint communique wasn't really hashed out with the Chinese until 1978, and it went into effect on the 1st of January 1979. So in the interim, though, the U.S. did establish what it called the United States Liaison Office. In China, this liaison office had a formal ambassador. So it wasn't an embassy, but rather there was a U.S. appointed ambassador. Probably most notable was George H.W. Bush was one of the ambassadors. I think there were like 4 or 5 during this time. So pretty quick succession between them. Anyway, that's kind of where a lot of the legwork got done to negotiate and sign the second communique.
This is just a quick thought. Obviously, diplomatic relations like this, it's a two-way street. Do you think, and I need to do some more research on this potentially, but that because Mao was still the chairman, that he, I don't know if slow roll is the right term, but he was potentially difficult for the United States to negotiate and work through this with, simply because of Mao's ideal. His ideals were much further left than Deng Xiaoping or
Right.
even Hua Gaofeng.
No, that's a really good point, Colin. Short answer is I haven't seen anything about Chairman Mao himself, like personally trying to slow roll the process. However, it wouldn't surprise me because Deng Xiaoping made a very famous visit to Washington, D.C., that Chairman Mao himself would have never done, not just for ideological reasons, but, health reasons. I mean, he died in 76. So,
He criticized Khrushchev for going to the U.S., if you remember from a couple episodes ago. So
right,
no,
yeah.
he would not have done that.
And Deng Xiaoping knew, he was a super smart dude. He knew, economically speaking, he needed the U.S. and that the U.S. wanted China. We're actually going to get into that in a future episode on all the different trade deals and the impact that they had on specifically the U.S. economy. But no, that's a good point. It wasn't just U.S. political considerations that I mentioned wasn't the only factor going on. It was Deng Xiaoping didn't officially take over from Hua Guofeng until what year was that? 78?
It was 78, but it was late in 78.
Yeah, so a lot of the negotiation for the second joint communique probably took place with both of those guys. And Deng was the dude that was able to finally seal the deal. So no, that's a good question.
So can you walk me through what this second joint communique and what that entailed and how that affected both China and Taiwan?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually, the communique is actually really short. So I'm actually going to read it. And then I'm going to summarize the three big takeaways. So there are 8 points in the communique. It's super short. So I'm going to read it real quick. Number 1, the United States of America and the People's Republic of China have agreed to recognize each other and to establish diplomatic relations as of January 1st, 1979. Number 2, the United States of America recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China, the communists, it doesn't, just letting our listeners know, those are the commies, as the sole legal government of China. Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. Number 3, the United States of America and the People's Republic of China reaffirm the principles agreed on by the two sides in the Shanghai Communique and emphasize once again that, number 4, both wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. Number 5, neither should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region or in any other region of the world, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. Number 6, neither is prepared to negotiate on behalf of any third party or to enter into agreements or understandings with the other directed at other states, cough, cough, NATO. Number 7, the government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Number 8, both believe that normalization of Sino-American relations is not only in the interest of the Chinese and American peoples, but also contributes to the cause of peace in Asia and the world.
So that's a huge shift away from what they said, 7 years ago in the first resolution, where they basically said there is one China, but we're not going to admit who it is. Here they flat out say there is one China in the PRC, and Taiwan is part of that.
Well, it's funny you say that. So real quick, I'm going to cover what this communique is saying, and then I'm also going to cover what's not saying, all right? Because a very common misunderstanding is that, well, there you have it. China is recognizing the PRC as the government of Taiwan. That's actually not what it's saying.
See, even the hosts learn a thing or two here.
So what this communique did is it did 3 main things. Number 1, it formally recognized and established relations between the U.S. and the PRC. Diplomatically speaking and economically speaking, that's important for different There's U.S. laws that prohibit the U.S. from doing certain things, like the U.S. government can't do certain things, like think Congress restricting the authority of the executive branch to do things that we haven't recognized relations with, etc. So formally establishing relations and like putting an embassy in one another's country, that is actually a big deal. It's not just simply a we're just like declaring, like Michael Scott in The Office, I declare a relationship. That's not what's going on. Like it's actually like it actually did do something. For those of y'all that didn't just get my reference,
You go watch The Office.
You got to watch The Office. Michael Scott declares bankruptcy by yelling, I declare bankruptcy.
It's one of the best scenes I've ever seen.
Ever. And Oscar's like, that's not how that works. He's like, you can't just say that. And he goes, I didn't say it. I declared it. Anyway.
So number three.
Sorry. Wait, number two. So first, it recognized and established relations between the U.S. and the PRC. Number two, it formally ended relations with Taiwan or the Republic of China. And this is important because that was that little blurb about, hey, we're going to maintain unofficial relations with people on Taiwan. That's what that means, is that the U.S. no longer recognizes the Republic of China, which is the formal name of Taiwan, as the government of China. And then lastly, number three, by doing that, number two, we agreed to cancel our mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. So, what this policy or what this communique did not do, much to the frustration of the CCP, was this policy did not recognize the CCP as the proper authoritative government over Taiwan. I know that can be really confusing because it literally says, let's see here. Number two, the United States of America recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. Our position on Taiwan, rather, is we do believe that there is a government on the island of Taiwan, and it is up to Taiwanese and the CCP to come to an agreement on what that government looks like. So this is the strategic ambiguity behind the one China policy, is that, hey, we're saying there's one China and we're saying that Taiwan belongs to China.
You guys just got to figure it out.
But we're saying you guys got to figure it out. We, the United States, are not going to come down on a side and say Taiwan, the government, like in a legal sense, that the CCP is the sovereign government over Taiwan.
Speaking of legal,
mm-hmm.
What kind of challenges? I feel like this might not have been popular within the U.S. at the time. Were there any legal hurdles internally with the U.S. to get this passed?
I want to say one more thing before we get into that, because I mentioned the one China principle, which is the current CCP articulation, in their own words, of right looks like. The key difference between the one China principle and the U.S. one China policy is the recognition of the CCP as the sovereign government over Taiwan. The CCP says that it is the sole legal authority over Taiwan, whereas the one China policy doesn't say that. It just says there is one China, Taiwan's a part of China, but you guys need to figure out what your thing is here. So the ambiguity has always been completely dependent upon what the position of the Taiwanese people themselves are. We did not, in this communique, we did not remove the recognition of the people of Taiwan to self-determination, which is a phrase in international relations theory that goes back to Woodrow Wilson when he talked about in his 14 points during World War I that all nations have a right to self-determination, i.e., if they want to be a free people, they have a right to pursue that. And it's honestly this anti-imperialist line of thinking that if these people want to be free, then the United States government supports them in being free. We didn't change that in this second joint communique, although we really blurred those lines.
Okay. So that was a great explanation. What legal hurdles did they face in the United States to get this thing passed?
Yeah. So uh, several, but we're going to focus on one, and it kind of focuses on the Mutual Defense Treaty. So Carter administration, Democrats. You know who hates Democrats? Republicans. So of course, uh, there's this God, Colin, help me, what's the phrase for the watchdog party? That's it. The Republicans at this time are the watchdog party, and to be the watchdog party, you basically have to disagree with whatever the other party's doing, right, wrong, or indifferent. Right. It is a drawback to the two-party system. We've talked about in previous episodes that the two-party system, I think, is actually better than a multi-party system. And if for those listeners that have been with us from the beginning, you will know that at least I, Jay, am anti-libertarian. so yeah, I think the two-party system, it has its shortfalls, but it's still the best system out there. One of those shortfalls is, of course, the Republicans are going to complain no matter what when the Democrats are in office, and vice versa. So what happened in 1978, 1979 was the Carter administration unilaterally withdrew from what was called the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, i.e., we were going to defend Taiwan. Well, that was an actual treaty that was ratified in the Senate, I believe during the Eisenhower administration, but I'm not entirely confident on that. So when the Carter administration unilaterally canceled this bad boy, the Republicans in the Senate lost their marbles. And a dude named Barry Goldwater, who
ran for president.
There's a very famous act that basically defined the U.S. military as it currently is, the Goldwater-Nichols Act. As I said, the U.S. military as we know it came into being because of the Goldwater-Nichols Act. So Barry Goldwater filed a lawsuit along with some other senators basically claiming that the Carter administration didn't have the legal grounds and was overstepping its bounds in its executive powers by unilaterally nullifying this treaty. Interestingly enough, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court dismissed the case. Colin did a really good episode on significant Supreme Court cases. If you guys want to scroll down and look at that one, but this is another just fascinating Supreme Court case. And the reason why the Supreme Court dismissed this case was because of something called in constitutional law called the political question, i.e., if a question is political in nature as opposed to legal in nature, the Supreme Court doesn't want to hear about it. The Supreme Court is not a political entity. Rather, it is a legal entity. That's why justices don't hold political parties. They're not partisan. Rather, they just interpret the Constitution and apply it in legal cases. So the reason why this was a political and not a legal matter was because the Senate had not actually formally challenged the executive branch by adopting a resolution. There was a draft resolution that could have been voted on in the Senate. And if it were to have been voted and approved by the Senate, I don't know if a simple majority or a supermajority would have done it, but if it would have been voted on and approved, it would have been a formal challenge, and then it would have been a legal question, not a political question. But because Goldwater and the other senators that filed this lawsuit with him chose to go the lawsuit route as opposed to the formal resolution voted upon by the members of the Senate route, it was a political question, not a legal question. And the Supreme Court dismissed it, and it ended there. And now we do not have a defense treaty with the Taiwanese.
So that's a really good transition point here, because I do want to talk about applying that to today. So there's no defense treaty. Let's throw a hypothetical out there. Let's say the Chinese do actually attempt an invasion of Taiwan. Does the U.S., in your opinion, have the legal? Well, I guess not even your opinion. Do they have the legal right to intervene?
Yeah. So I think it's one that's a great question. Two, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the U.S. was not treaty allies with Kuwait. So we didn't have a defense treaty with Kuwait. But so the legal justification for kicking the Iraqi army out of Kuwait was a UN resolution. So we gained legal justification through international law that was agreed upon there in the UN. So it kind of depends. And the Chinese know this. When it comes to what happens in a PRC Taiwanese conflict, it is super hard to say what's going to happen because nobody knows how it's going to happen. If one day, all of a sudden, we all wake up and we see the morning news, read the morning news, and we see missiles are impacting Taiwan, to me, that it would be pretty easy to come up with a legal justification to repel the Chinese. Because frankly, diplomatically speaking, and the Chinese know this, they're very much isolated. There are way more countries that would fall in line that the U.S. would be able to pressure in the UN to condemn, to do whatever to condemn that invasion.
So I do want to bring up a point, and we're talking about the legality and is the U.S. bound by any kind of treaty or act? And we talked about it, the strategic ambiguity you mentioned just recently when you were talking about the second communique. We also have this strategic ambiguity with Taiwan, with the Taiwan Relations Act and the Six Assurances. So these were signed kind of on the flip side of this, what was going on with China in the early 80s during the Reagan administration in 82. And, so when you have this second communique signed, the Taiwanese were obviously very upset. And I believe they basically said something along the lines of, you've basically thrown us and given us up to red tyranny. They were not happy about this. Whereas when we signed this Taiwan Relations Act and these Six Assurances, basically Deng Xiaoping viewed it as us being insincere and being a bad international partner. And we can't really say ally, but at least partner. And we were insincere in our negotiations, when in reality, we are still trying to hold the Chinese in check. And I do want to read a couple excerpts from the Taiwan Relations Act because it's relevant. So in the act, it states that the United States will make available in Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. And it goes on to say, shall maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security, social, economic systems of the people of Taiwan. And then within the Six Assurances, and this was in 82, we do not agree to set a date certain for ending arms sales to Taiwan. We see no mediation role in the United States between Taiwan and PRC. We see no attempt to exert pressure on Taiwan to enter negotiations with the PRC. There will be no change in the longstanding position of the issue of sovereignty over Taiwan, or there has been no change. And we have no plans to seek revisions to the Taiwan Relations Act, and the August 17th communique should not be read to imply that we have agreed to engage in prior consultations with Beijing on arms sales to Taiwan. It's a lot of reading and a lot of stuff, but what it does is it provides us just enough wiggle room that we can continue providing arms and services, and that if we view the Chinese invasion of Taiwan as something that is going to destabilize the peace of the Western Pacific, we are able to intervene. So I read all that to simply say that technically speaking, legally speaking, we can invade. And that's really what's holding the Chinese at bay. the fact that they know that the U.S. can prevent or intervene and prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It's important to note because, as we've seen with some of these war games, the United States is going to be very reliant on South Korea, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, some of these other allies within the area to call them to aid in their assistance in fighting the Chinese.
Yeah. It's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking about like, so Reagan, after all this happened, Reagan actually kind of got in hot water with his own administration because he, again, the Soviet Union has always been, or at least at that time had always been, a little bit more important than China. They were the big threat, and old Ronnie Reagan ran on a very hardline hawkish stance towards the Soviet Union, Iran, you name it. Like he was hawkish. Well, that included somewhat China, anti-communist. And he actually kind of got in hot water because he talked about defending Taiwan after he got elected, but prior to him being inaugurated, he talked about, like, a public speech was like, and we're going to make sure that we defend the Taiwanese and blah, blah, blah. And then like future administration people were like, whoa, 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 whoa.
We just negotiated this. Don't open your mouth right now, please.
And they issued, like, so candidate Reagan, he was elected, but he had not been inaugurated. But candidate Reagan's staff actually issued an apology, saying like, "Hey, yeah, didn't mean to say that." Blah 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 blah.
Well, it's because the Chinese, you brought up the Soviets, at this point were still kind of viewed, and they positioned themselves as a united front. You heard that again, a united front, the CCP and the KMT, if you remember from the Sino-Japanese War, the second one, there was a united front. They positioned themselves as a united front actually against the Soviet Union. So yes, that was the big dog, the big enemy were the Soviets, and any weakening of the alliance against the Soviets, yes, was considered problematic. But I think it's important to note that, and by the way, that Taiwan Relations Act and those 6 assurances were reaffirmed in 2016. So they're still, as of right now, being upheld. And if you remember from the news, Nancy Pelosi, it was a big deal making a visit to Taiwan because the Chinese viewed it as, like, obviously don't recognize the Republic of China anymore, but the Speaker of the House visiting a country on an official visit is seen as kind of a political slap in the face, or a diplomatic slap in the face to the CCP, especially going to Taiwan, which is such a hot button issue. But the reality is, so I talked about the legal precedent set. The reality is, in Collin's opinion, that Taiwan would be defended simply because of their extreme economic value that they bring to the United States right now with microchip technology and some of the technology that they produce in semiconductors that is produced nowhere else. They have the infrastructure and the equipment to do it. So Nancy Pelosi was going to visit, I think, partly going to visit those factories to make sure that everything is okay, because that's really what we would be defending. I think you get into kind of we have the legal justification to get involved. There's a moral obligation. Do we want to stop the communists? But every moral action, I feel like, still has kind of a what's in it for me? Is the juice worth the squeeze here? Like, are we going to go send a lot of Americans to die to defend this place for no reason other than stopping communism? Well, no. We want to make sure we get something out of it. And part of that, I believe, is the economic value that Taiwan brings right now. And they are absolutely going to maximize their value, economically speaking, with the semi-chips or semiconductors and microchips. So that's why I think we would, A, legally be able to, and B, for the strategic value of Taiwan. I don't think there would be any sort of moral crisis in the United States that would incentivize us to go over there. It would be completely strategic in nature.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. We've talked about the two competing schools of international relations, very broadly speaking, is the realist and the idealist school. The idealist school, kind of to your point, Collin, it's like, we're going to fight for this liberal world order. And it's like, is it really worth it?
We're going to spread democracy.
Yeah. We're here to
tongue in
liberate
cheek.
you.
I just think I don't know if I need to post this meme so people can understand it, but it's SpongeBob SquarePants, and they're like walking out of a burning city, and they're like, "We did it, Patrick! We saved the city," and the city's just rubble and just flattened down to nothingness, and it's kind of a joke, like, "We've liberated you, we've liberated you from this evil." All right, see you guys later.
So, as you're talking, I was reminded about Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, which, folks, if you have not read the history of the Peloponnesian War, you have to. You must. It is absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend getting the landmark Thucydides. I forget the editor's name and translator's name. Forgive me, but it's called Landmark Thucydides. It has maps. It's got tons of footnotes. If you try to read like the Penguin Classics, it's a good translation, but there's just so many like names and places and things like that. It's really hard to follow along if you can't see it. Whereas the Landmark Thucydides has like maps on nearly every single page that's like, oh, this is the village they're talking about. It's here. Anyway, so Thucydides, one of the things that makes Thucydides such a classic is that the things in which he talks about are timeless and they apply to so many different situations. So during the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between Athens and Sparta and their allies, right, and various partners, the Persians got involved late, and Athens and Sparta decided to fight this war because Athens' power was growing and the Spartans were afraid of their power. Athens was a naval power, Sparta was a land power, and this war went on for over a decade. At one point in the war, there was this tiny island in the Aegean called Melos, and the people that lived there were called the Melians. And there is one of the best like just scenes in all of history, if I can be so bold, is a thing called the Melian dialogue. You could literally just pick up a copy of the history of the Peloponnesian War and just read the Melian dialogue, and it's already worth whatever you paid for it. And there's so many copies you could probably get it pretty cheap. Anyway, this Melian dialogue is just a conversation between the Athenian diplomats and the Melian diplomats, and it's one of the best just like give and takes of all like international relations, human nature, like philosophy. Like these are Greeks, think Greek philosophers that are writing this stuff. There are just two things that I want to talk about. So if anyone has heard the phrase, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, that comes from the Melian dialogue. So I'm going to read a little bit of the context here. So 2 paragraphs. First one's the Melian diplomats, the second one's the Athenians. So this is the Melians. It is natural and I should go back. The context of this dialogue was so Melos was a colony of Sparta, but they had not yet joined the war. So the Athenian diplomats came to them and said, hey, you guys need to abandon Sparta or we're going to invade you and kill you. And so this is a negotiation between Melos and Athens, where Athens is trying to get the Melians to stand down or trying to get the Melians to basically surrender, whereas Melos is trying to say like, we're neutral, we're not involved in this war, even though they're kind of friendly to the Spartans. All right, first paragraph, Melos. It is natural and understandable that people who are placed as we should have recourse to all kinds of arguments and different points of view. However, you are right in saying that we are met together here to discuss the safety of our country, and if you will have it so, the discussions shall proceed on the lines that you have laid down. So it's just like this introductory, this is why we're here, so on and so forth. Athens, and this is the key paragraph, Athens. Then we on our side will use no fine phrases saying, For example, that we have a right to our empire because we defeated the Persians, or that we have come against you now because of the injuries that you have done to us, a great mass of words that nobody would believe. And we ask you on your side not to imagine that you will influence us by saying that you, though a colony of Sparta, have not joined Sparta in the war, or that you have never done us any harm. Instead, we recommend that you should try to get what is possible for you to get, taking into consideration what we both really do think. Since you know as well as we do that, when these matters are discussed by practical people, listen in, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel. And in that fact, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. So here's why I'm reading this paragraph here. So Melos begins the dialogue. This is just to give context, saying, hey, this is why we're here. Athens responds and says, great, I'm glad we're on the same page. So we're not going to waste our time trying to make these superficial arguments that nobody believes, i.e., we've got a right to our empire. Athens is rejecting the idealist school of international relations and they are fully committed to the realist school of thought, so much so that they are saying the standard of justice depends upon the equality of power to compel, i.e., Athens is like the strongest power in town. Melos is this really tiny island that knows they can't defend themselves. And that's why we see the strong do what they have, or another translation of the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must is the strong do what they have the power to do and the weak accept what they have to accept, i.e., I'm Athens, I'm the strong power, I'm going to do what I want to do, and you, Melos, who are weak, you have to accept what you have to accept, i.e., you have to do what you have to do. So when it comes to China and Taiwan, it is very clear here who the stronger power is, right? And China is basically saying, like, we beat you during the Civil War. You are a tiny island that is right next to our country. We can do what we want to do. You have to give over what you want to do. Or sorry, you have to give over because you have to. One more little blurb here. And this is super hard because the Melian dialogue is all of it is awesome. But here, a few paragraphs later, this is how the Melians respond. And how could it be just for us to be the slaves as for you to be the masters? How is it good for us to be slaves and you to be the masters? The Athenians, you, by giving in, would save yourself from disaster. We, by not destroying you, would be able to profit from you. This is extremely important to the Chinese, by the way. They don't want to destroy Taiwan. They want those semiconductors. They want those people. They want those taxes. They want Taipei intact. It's not good for the CC or for PRC to destroy Taiwan. The Athenians are making the same argument here. Going on, the Melians. So you would not agree to being our neutral friends instead of enemies, but allies of neither side? Athenians, no, because it is not so much your hostility that injures us. Rather, it is the case that if we were on friendly terms with you, our subjects would regard that as a sign of weakness in us, whereas your hatred is evidence of our power. So Athens is saying here, we cannot be friends or neutral with you because the sheer fact that you exist is a declaration of our weakness, and we cannot abide.
So, Jay, how does that relate to Taiwan, China, and the other U.S. allies with all of this going on? Because it's a great dialogue, first off,
right.
But it does relate heavily to what is happening here in other allies.
Well, in a lot of different ways too, right? So there's the obvious, clear, like, China-Taiwan dichotomy here, where, like, that's the immediate relevance. Is like China is not going to stop until Taiwan is a part of China. Like, I truly believe that even if we fight a war, even if either by the Taiwanese by themselves or through some kind of international, i.e., international support, the Taiwanese were able to defend themselves, they would lose that war, and then hopefully 50 years later, there would be another one. Like, it would be like a World War I, World War II. Like, as long as the CCP is in power, they will not stop because, and that's why I read that second thing. It is not so much your hostility that injures us. Rather, is the case that if we were on friendly terms with you, our subjects would regard that as a sign of weakness in us. Whereas your hatred, i.e., their hatred for the Melians, is evidence of our power. Long story short here, to tell you guys what happens, spoiler alert, the Melians refuse, and the Athenians invade and kill all of them. It's one of the more brutal aspects, and this happens relatively early in the war, by the way, where like literally every male on the island dies, regardless of age, and all of their women are either given over to Athenian men or sold into sex slavery, basically, back in Athens. So like Melos functionally ceases to exist in this story. So another aspect of relevancy here is if that's what China's calculus is, that could also be the United States calculus, right? Like, there is, if the Chinese, in the same way that the Athenians doubled down on this realistic school of thought, then there's nothing to prevent the United States from then looking at China and saying, the standard of justice depends on the equality of power to compel, and that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. I've said it before on this podcast. The United States is still the strongest country that has ever existed in all of human civilization. Like, we still got it, folks. I promise. Is everything perfect? No. Are there very real problems that we need to address? Yes, and of course. However, like, if we really wanted to, we could inflict a pain on the PRC that this world has never seen. What's holding us back is not ability. What is holding us back is will. And I'm not saying that would be just. I'm just trying to say that there's, like, if we accept the terms as the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, then in this instance between the U.S. and China, China is weak. The U.S. and the West writ large is strong, right? So there's another standard to say, like, if we were to ask the question, like, well, should the U.S. get involved? Jay's personal inclination is, heck yeah, because we can. Like, we could, in the same way that I've argued that we should have gotten involved in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we should get involved in China for no other reason than we can. And it's good for the international order writ large to have a democratic power that respects human rights, defending and willing to commit acts of violence in defense of innocent people.
Wow. That is a lot to process. I think that's a good note to wrap up on. We wrap up with a bang here.
Oh, shoot, yeah.
I think what you just added is a little bit of perspective in a great way to reframe the situation that is occurring right now. The Melian dialogue is a great way to look at it. And you're right, from an American, from a Chinese perspective, I think that's going to start to drive the next couple episodes that we have, where we start talking about trade in the 80s and 90s and even through to today. We're going to get into the next Taiwan Strait crisis. We're going to talk about the quote unquote trade war that occurred with Donald Trump, and then where it is leading us to within the next 10 to 15 years, potentially in conflict with the Chinese. So I think that was a good stopping point, because I think it helps, Jay, what you just said helps kind of put a great perspective on what people should be looking at this as. It's not the strong do as they will, and the weak do as they must. It's pretty much how it is with Taiwan. They're the Melians. They're the island of Melos right now,
right?
And they're caught between two superpowers.
I'm even reminded of a Jordan Peterson not quote, but just comment that he actually likes to say repeatedly. Now, and he's speaking about the individual, and he's addressing like masculinity in general, but I think it applies to what we're talking about here. And that is, there is no moral virtue in being weak. Rather, there is moral virtue in being strong and being able to control it. So for the United States here, there is no moral virtue in saying we're not going to do anything. Rather, there is moral virtue in saying we are going to freaking
we're gonna defend Taiwan.
We are able to punch you in the frickin' face, and we will.
We will if you do something. If you do something, yeah,
right.
All right.
That's all right. There we go. That's a good note to end.
All right. So just in closing, Jay, great episode. I think we're going to continue on this series next week when we start talking about deals with the devil. Was these trade agreements and this new relationship that we've created with China, was it a net positive or net negative for the U.S. economy? I think that's going to be an interesting way to look at it, because we've heard, just mentioned with the Trump campaign, that was one of their big focuses, were the unfair trade agreements and the effects of those trade agreements over time. And so was it a net benefit or a net negative? We'll continue on. And if you guys want to follow us on social media, give us a follow. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, on different versions of at Loins of History. Give us a 5-star review. Helps the algorithm out, whether you're not listening on Podcast Addict, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or what other medium you can listen to podcasts on. Give us a rating. We'll give you a shout out if you give us the 5-star rating, just because it helps the algorithm, and it got to write a review as well so we can take a look and see what your rating was. So, and we love getting feedback as well, whether you send us a message or interact with us on social media. We like getting feedback and interacting with any folks that are out there that love history. So thank you for listening, and we'll hope to see you next week.